Hello and welcome to the 5 Things You Need to Know podcast. I am Chubby Jayaram Singh and I produce business and investment stories for Money Mind on CNA. In this episode, we are looking at the 5 things you need to know about the circular economy. Joining me now is Jessica Cheam, founder of Eco Business, a media platform dedicated to sustainable business, and Dr. Rebecca Summers, partner at consulting firm McKinsey Company. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for having us, Chubby.
Let's get straight to it. What is the circular economy?
The circular economy basically is a system in which there is no waste. All materials are put into a continuous loop back into the economy so that we can always use resources continuously and there is no waste and we are not using virgin resources.
Circular economy is the transition from linear economy to circular. And for me to define circular, let me define linear economy first. Linear economy is where you take raw materials, produce a product, use it, and then dispose of it. So it's quite linear in the way that you make and use and dispose. The circular economy tries to elongate the process between making the product and disposing of the product. And there's 2 major loops in the way you elongate the process. First of all, there's what we call the technical loop. So instead of just disposing the product outright, you can reuse it, you can refurbish it, you can remanufacture the item or recycle. So there's a lot of different business models and technologies that enable us to prolong the life cycle of the product. There's also what we call the bio loop. So if we make products based on biodegradable materials, renewable materials, we can return the resources back to the earth so that we can reuse it again. So that's circular economy in a nutshell.
Rebecca, let's move on to the second takeaway from our list and talk about why the circular economy is important, especially now when the need to mitigate climate change is becoming increasingly urgent. And when we talk about circularity, why isn't recycling enough?
Yep, so there's 3 major drivers of why circular economy is important. First is finite resources. When we think about our population, it's growing rapidly. It's supposed to hit 8.5 billion by 2030, of which 3 billion will enter the consuming middle class in the next 15 years. This means that more people would want to buy things and that more things will be manufactured and therefore our resources will be strained. Second, if we were to look at climate change broadly, there is a 2-degree scenario where countries stacked hand during the Paris Agreement to mitigate global warming to under 2 degrees Celsius. This means that there needs to be a fundamental shift in the way we consume energy, the way we consume products. And finally, you mentioned recycling, but recycling isn't the most efficient lever of circular economy. There's opportunities to redesign, there's opportunities to reuse. So all these levers collectively are important in order to make sure that we leverage the most opportunities for our sustainable goals.
Following up from what Rebecca said, I think I agree that recycling is only one small part of the equation. We must be very careful to not treat recycling as a panacea. Because firstly, recycling takes a lot of energy to reprocess materials from one state to another. And in some cases, recycling is just not a possible method of reusing resources for some materials. And so I think in the very first place, we need to be very smart about how we design products and services to ensure that as little virgin resources are used as possible. And whatever that is used is then put back into the system using technological innovations to reprocess and to create new materials out of it. So that is really truly a circular model. And that's why recycling is only just one small part of the equation.
Before we move on to the 4th and 5th things on our list and look at how we can measure outcomes in a circular economy and where the investment opportunities are, let's now talk about some challenges. On our panel, we have Jessica Cheam, founder of Eco Business, and Dr. Rebecca Summers, partner at McKinsey Company. Jessica, what are some of the challenges you are seeing as we transition to a circular economy?
I think there are a lot of vested interests in the linear economy. For decades, manufacturers and big companies have been thriving on the fact that we are consuming more, we're producing more, and their systems are so rooted in, extracting virgin materials. It is now cheaper to go and fall a tree and get virgin pulp than it is to recycle paper sometimes. And the same can be said for a lot of resources. And we need government leadership, we need civic society, we need companies to really work together to put in systems in which we are incentivizing people to reuse and to recycle. Because without those systems and those mechanisms, you are going to see that people are still going to continue using virgin resources instead.
When you think about a circular economy, one thing to note is that a full collaboration is required across the value chain, from producers to consumers to waste collectors and people who recycle. And one of the first challenges that a company might face was an economic challenge. It might not be economic or the most profitable way for them to ensure that a product is made of recycled materials or you recycle the product. Second would be a lack of consumer awareness. So if I were to take plastic recycling as an example, consumers have to be aware that this is a problem and that they need to be aware of different methods of separating waste, making sure that you can clean the plastics to ensure that it's in the proper waste stream. Third could be a lack of infrastructure. So taking the plastics example again, looking at waste collection systems. A lot of the waste collection in Southeast Asia relies on informal waste collection. So it's very difficult to have this at scale. And finally, there's also government mandates. So if we were to compare some of the European examples where there's a Green New Deal, there's a big carbon framework to make Europe carbon neutral by 2050, there's other economies that can probably look at that and push towards more sustainable goals. There are drivers that's shifting a lot of companies and countries towards sustainability and circular economy. Because resource prices are rising, people and companies are willing to pay for the use of materials versus owning materials. So by changing the very business model, manufacturers are more incentivized to ensure a prolonged life cycle of a product versus just manufacturing more and more of the same product.
All right, moving on to the fourth thing on our top 5 list, outcomes. As we transition to circularity and we see this take place across industries and verticals, how do we know we have arrived and what are some of the tangible outcomes we can look at?
That's a very good question because there's no one single answer on how to measure circular economy. It encompasses a broad range of topics and there's different levers and not one solution fits all. There's a few ways of looking at it. One could be a sustainability metric. You could look at the amount of products and trash that reaches the landfill. Is it being mitigated? You could look at the amount of carbon footprint that is being reduced along a particular manufacturing process or a value chain across the supplier, producer, and consumer. You could look at the amount of resources that are decreasing in a particular company. Per your earlier question, it's also a cost reduction lever because you're not using as much resources. So these are all outcome metrics, but you can also look at input metrics. You could look at the increasing number of companies coming forward and committing to a certain sustainability target. You can also look at countries mandating different sustainability targets across the nation. So in addition to sustainability targets, you can look at the financial metrics. You can look at the total return of shareholders. And we do see that companies that are focused on sustainability and circular economy tend to have higher returns than those who are not.
When you think about circularity, a key question you need to ask yourself is there waste generated? If there is waste, then it's not truly circular. A truly circular business model really looks at every single waste stream and converts it into something else. And they always say like one man's trash is another man's treasure. And I think that really hits the nail on the head because there are a lot of waste streams that we see on the market today that can totally be converted into something else. And if you look at nature, biomimicry is something that a lot of scientists actually look at because if you look at how nature works, there's never any waste. The waste product of one animal goes into feeding plants, and it's the kind of same processes that we need to think and we need to bring that into our manufacturing cycles. Otherwise, then we are exposing ourselves to huge risks in the future if one, we face resource scarcity, two, we face open pollution, and three, we just have limited choices as to how we can get our products and services. And so I think that it's very, very crucial. The circular economy was a concept that is a lot more mature in Europe, for example, than it is in Asia. But Asian governments, I think, are realizing and they're waking up to this. When China banned the import of wastes a couple of years ago, it caused massive crisis in the industry and all over the world because suddenly people didn't know what to do with their waste. And I think that's really spurred a question for people to really think deeply about what do you do about the waste that you generate. How do we get populations to firstly reduce everything that they consume so they don't generate that kind of volume of waste? And then with the materials that are being generated, how do we put them into processes that's going to make sure that it gets reused? So I think this is a very exciting space and there's a lot of business opportunity here.
Just to take stock, we have been talking about the 5 things you need to know about the circular economy. We have looked at what the circular economy is and why do we need it, challenges we face as we shift to a circular economy. We also talked about how we can measure outcomes in a circular economy, and we have kept the best for last, the money question. So if I were an investor, how do I invest in the circular economy and where do I start?
Depends on how much money you have. If you want to invest in the circular economy, there are actually a lot of opportunities out there now. In fact, if you look at the VC funds or the private equity funds, they're looking at opportunities in the waste sector. The highest read stories on eco-business are always waste stories because people feel very passionately about it. You can see the open pollution. Nobody wants to live in a place where your environment is polluted. Plastics, for example, there's a huge sea change in attitudes towards plastics. 10 years ago, nobody cared if you were using plastics. And then now, everyone is trying to move away from using plastics because of the pollution in the rivers, in the oceans, and, the impact on biodiversity. And unfortunately, COVID, I think, has undone some of the things that we've seen on plastic recycling. But this is exactly why we need to pay attention. For example, medical waste. It's a very, very under-researched area, and medical waste is highly pollutive as well. And with COVID and the pandemic, we're generating huge volumes, but we have no way to process it. And so I think the investment opportunities are out there for companies who have the technologies and the processes to help us to solve these problems. And I think that if you want to put your money in there, there's a lot of opportunity out there.
The circular economy is here to stay, and we do identify a set of multiple billion-dollar industries that are primed and expected to mature circular economy practices, thereby leading to an investment opportunity of over $1 trillion. So you could look at investment opportunities through single stocks of companies with a sustainability agenda. You could look at a sustainability fund. In addition, there's a lot of startups in circular economy that are emerging that could be a good investment opportunity as well.
Are there any specific sectors of interest to you?
Yes, there are different themes that are emerging right now. One is around the built environment. And this is about the modular design and use of building infrastructure, where they're made of recycled materials, they're modular so they can be assembled and disassembled at will. They could be linked to a shared space platform. So it's a use of space in a circular way. So you just don't build a building and let it stand, but it's more modular. There's a theme around mobility, making sure that the use of vehicles are zero emission vehicles. The vehicles are made of refurbished or recycled parts, and also shared mobility platforms. There's also a big theme around nutrition and food waste. So digital apps and platforms that track food from farm to table, ensuring minimization of food waste. This is a bio-loop of circular economy, but any type of food waste goes back to the earth. From an industrial perspective, there's a lot of theme on textiles and electronics just because they're ripe for the use of recycled materials. And it's also quite resource intensive. So any technologies that mitigate the use of resources, they're focused on those sectors. In Southeast Asia in particular, there's a lot of talk around plastic recycling and waste management. Because plastic waste is an issue. Southeast Asia has been identified as one of the major areas with the most ocean plastic. And there's a lot of initiatives that is trying to combat that going forward.
For the average person, you should really think about, where your money goes and what products and materials you're buying. Because if we can help to support companies that support the circular economy transition, then we should be doing that. We should not be buying products and services from companies who are still in that linear model where anything that you use, gets disposed of in a very irresponsible manner. And if we can create the kind of movement among consumers, then we're going to see the acceleration of the economy.
All right. Thank you so much, Rebecca and Jessica, for being on the podcast. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed myself.
Thank you for having me on the show.
We've been talking to Jessica Cheam, founder of Eco Business, a media platform dedicated to sustainable business, and Dr. Rebecca Sommers, partner at McKinsey Company. Thank you for listening to the 5 Things You Need to Know podcast by CNA's Money Mind team. Tell your friends about us on social media. Catch us again next time.